Good afternoon. So I'll be talking about reviewing different methods for resolving multipath interference in time-of-flight range cameras. So to start with, I'm from New Zealand, and I'm from the University of Waikato, which is in the town of Hamilton, which is in the central North Island. So I will start with, I think the computer may have crashed. Let's try this again. Okay, so what this slide talks about is in time-of-flight range cameras, you illuminate the scene with amplitude modulated light, and you correlate the returning light with a known reference signal, and what you measure is a cosine. So this is using the indirect time-of-flight range measurement that has been talked about by previous presenters. And I'll just skip to the next slide. So multipath interference causes significant errors in time-of-flight range cameras. So at the moment, there are two forward models used. There is a sparse and there is a diffuse forward model. So for the diffuse forward model, you illuminate the scene, and the diffuse and the multipath is caused by interreflections in the scene. So it's diffuse. The one pixel is contributed by many other pixels in the scene, and the other forward model is the sparse forward model, where there's 2 returns per pixel, or 2 or 3 returns per pixel. And this is the case where you have a translucent sheet in front of the scene. And the reason that this is a difficult problem is that because you're measuring a complex value, when you have multiple returns, the complex values add on the complex plane. So what you measure is one vector, but it can be made out of 2 or more vectors. So when you only have one measurement, there are infinite number of vectors that can combine together to produce the vector that you measure. So this is a trapdoor function. So this is why it's such a difficult problem to try and resolve. So this multipath interference is caused by interreflections, subsurface scattering such as wax, mixed pixels where one pixel integrates light from both the foreground object and the background object, and volumetric scattering. And the mathematical representation of the sparse model is the sum of the individual returns. While for the diffuse model, you have one direct return, and you have an integral which combines all the other returns from a further distance to infinity. So the methods that I'm going to be reviewing today are direct and global separation. So this is work that I've done at my research group, and the work by Matthew O'Toole. I'm going to be talking about sparse deconvolution, which I've called coded time of flight. So this is work that we did in collaboration with MIT. And we're going to talk about 2 multi-frequency techniques. So these are techniques where multiple measurements are taken at different modulation frequencies. So the first technique is what I've called mixed pixel. This is work by a previous PhD student at the University of Waikato. And the other one is a technique which I've called OMP, which is developed at MIT. So I'll quickly go over each of these methods very quickly, and then I'll go into the results. So for direct and global, how we define the problem is the measurement is a direct return plus a global return, which is everything else. So to solve this problem, the scene is illuminated with a checkerboard pattern. So you have squares which are illuminated and squares which are not illuminated. In the illuminated region, you measure the direct return and half the global return, because the global return is present everywhere, and you're only illuminating half the scene because it's a checkerboard. And in the dark regions, you only measure half the global return. Obviously, for this to work, the global return has to be spatially smooth, so you can't have specular reflections. And then you illuminate the scene with the inverse checkerboard pattern, and for each pixel, you measure the opposite. So here you have 2 measurements and you have 2 unknowns. Therefore, you can combine those together to calculate the direct return and the global return. So when you do this with a time-of-flight range camera, you need at least 2 depth frames. However, because you have a coordinate mismatch between the method that you use to project the images and your camera, you have issues at edges. So normally people use at least 25 depth frames to compute the global, direct and global return. For the sparse deconvolution method, instead of illuminating the scene with an amplitude modulated light source, we illuminate the scene with a binary sequence. And what you measure at each pixel is the cross correlation between the reflected light and the reference binary sequence. So on your left is what you measure when you only have one return present, and on your right in the blue is what you measure when you have 2 returns present. So you can see there's multiple echoes in that blue signal. So by performing sparse deconvolution on that signal, you can recover both the distance and the amplitudes of those 2 returns. And this requires about 2,000 samples on the correlation waveform to be able to measure, to be able to recover the different propagation paths. So for the mixed pixel method, what it assumes is that there are 2 returns. So you have 2 amplitude returns and 2 phase returns. So by taking measurements at 2 frequencies, one double the other, you're able to compute a lookup table based on taking the relative amplitudes and the relative phases. And if you compute the lookup table in advance, this is very quick to compute. For OMP, you solve the formulation given here. We have phi g, z is equal to phi g. So z is what you measure as complex values. The matrix phi encodes the phases of each return, and g encodes the amplitudes, and you have additive Gaussian noise. So by enforcing sparsity on this problem, you can solve it using orthogonal matching pursuits. However, this requires a minimum of 5 evenly spaced frequencies, and in this case, we use 8. Because you're using orthogonal matching pursuits, you can specify the number of returns that you're looking for. In this case, we'll specify that we're looking for 2 returns. So this table gives you a quick overview of the methods for resolving multipath interference that we're going to look at. So when you have no correction, the number of frames you need is 4, because you need at least 3, normally 4 raw frames to compute a depth frame. When you're using direct and global, you need at least 2 depth frames, so you need at least 8 raw frames. For coded time of flight, you need at least 1,000. In our case, we're using 1,780, and the computation is high. For the mixed pixel, you only need 2 frequencies, so again, only 8 raw frames. And OMP, we need 5 frequencies, so that's 20 raw frames. For this equipment setup, we built a custom time-of-flight camera based around a PMD 19K3 sensor. So it has 120 by 160 pixels. And we attached it to a DMD projector to be able to project the patterns for the direct and global separation. So for the first experiment, we placed the translucent sheet 2.2 meters in front of a garden gnome. So this is what the garden gnome looks like through the translucent sheet. And what we're trying to do is resolve the translucent sheet and the garden gnome. For the second experimental setup, we constructed a corner out of diffused white cardboard. So this is a photo of the camera in action. So for the results for measuring of the garden gnome. So here is the distance error of the garden gnome when there is no correction. So here some parts of the garden gnome are out by 2.2 meters. And in the case where we use the mixed pixel restoration, most of the garden gnome is less than 10 centimeters of error. And remember, the garden gnome is over 2 meters away from the camera. And in the case of using OMP, most of the gnome is again reduced significantly down. However, due to non-linearities between the frequencies, there is increased noise. Again, this is what you get when you use the coded time of flight. So again, nearly all the pixels are reduced below 10 centimeters. However, you do get some erroneous pixels that don't compute to the right depth. However, when you use direct and global separation, the error actually increases. This is because the forward model for the direct and global assumed a diffuse forward model, and in this case we have a specular forward model. They actually have a specular return. So the forward model is wrong, so therefore it doesn't produce the right result. Now, we do for the corner. So this is the corner with no correction. So the black line is what we should actually measure. So this is a three-dimensional point cloud. So on your left is a orthogonal view of the corner, and on the right is a bird's eye view of the point cloud. And this is a falsely colored image, so the red pixels are further away and the blue pixels are closer. So you can see here, because of the interreflections in the corner, you have a smoothed out corner, and it doesn't resolve the corner properly. When we apply direct and global separation, because the forward model is correct, we actually recover the corner properly. So this manages to resolve the multipath that is present in a corner. However, when we apply the same technique for the mixed pixel, the noise explodes due to the method being very sensitive to noise, and it just can't find the different returns. So when we use the coded time of flight, again, it doesn't resolve the corner properly, and due to the properties of the sparse deconvolution and how it quantizes the depth, we actually get a quantized corner. And for the OMP method, again, the noise has increased significantly and we don't recover the corner properly. So what we decided to do is perhaps we can combine the two results. So we placed a translucent sheet a meter in front of the camera and we placed the corner 2 meters behind the translucent sheet. And so what we're able to do is by combining the coded time of flight and direct and global separation, we're able to measure this graph. So the black line, the direct line, is what we measure from one slice to the corner by the combination of both techniques, and the sparse line is what we measure just by doing the coded time of flight. So you don't actually recover the corner properly, but you don't get interference from the translucent sheet. So in conclusion, multipath does cause significant accuracy errors in time-of-flight cameras. Normally, people have presented two forward models to solve this, a sparse and a diffuse. However, there needs to be work to combine these two models into a better forward model that can resolve all forms of multipath, where it would be diffuse and specular at the same time. And this is what we're looking to work on next. And what we need is a better detection when multipath is present. So if you looked at the cases of the OMP and the mixed pixel, the noise increased when we tried to resolve multipath and the algorithm didn't work. And that's my talk. Do you have any questions?